was the emergency explanation of human beings who no European man could understand, and whose humanity so frightened and humiliated the immigrants, the Dutch coming to South Africa, that they no longer cared to belong to the same species. The Boers imagined different races as a way of explaining why people who were fundamentally more or less human could be so radically different. And Arendt goes on to make a big point of this idea of race coming out of South Africa in the 1600s, eventually worked its way into Germany and became the seed, or one of the seeds for what would eventually become Nazism. 20th century, the imagination of African art and primitive art had a profound influence on the way that Western art changed. Picasso comes along at a time when there's a real crisis in the Western art world, as you know, and when there's a real sense in France and in Spain and Western Europe by the beginning of the 20th century that pointillism and expressionism and what Matisse and Van Gogh were about is not saying what needs to be said about the human condition. There's this search for other ways of expressing what's going on in society at the time. And Picasso, before his discovery of the primitive, gives us these kind of works, such as The Old Guitar Player of 1903, and The Acrobat and the Young Harlequin of 1905. To my eye, these are very rooted in the tradition that Picasso was trained in, these early works. These works are fairly literalist, although they reflect some of what artists who came before him were struggling with in terms of how to find a new way to express the meaning of the human condition at the time. They're not fully literalist, but they're not a real break with the past. And then Picasso discovers this, and his fellow Cubists, some of them who traveled to Africa. Picasso wasn't one of them, but who look at this kind of work, which is very typical of West African art, and say, my goodness, there's something about how to capture the human form and the human spirit which is very different here. And it has an amazing influence on what Picasso becomes. And you see the later art, just a few years later, by 1907, you see this encounter with the primitive, with the so-called primitive there, as a way that he incorporates an idea of what Africa is about and what Africa expresses into his own work. And again, what is it? It's not really Africa that much. It's a European or Western imagination of the Africa, which we use and recreate to suit purposes of our own. And this is perfectly natural that everyone does this, but what Africa occupies that particular blank space in our imagination, which we fill with all kinds of things that are profoundly worthwhile and useful in our own lives. The other piece that I would call your attention to is Guernica, 1937, Picasso's, which is a piece that he paints in response to the horrors of the Spanish-American War. I'm sorry, the Spanish Civil War. And in the horror of the Spanish Civil War, which is really the first conflict of the 20th century, and teaches the Nazis and Mussolini how to wage war against civilians and to use the brutalization of civilians as a tactic in war. In some ways, Picasso had it right in 1907 with his discovery of African art. The old European styles could never express the dehumanization and the horror that the Spanish Civil War was about. And in fact, it's this turn to another style that gives Picasso the new tools to make sense. Again, Africa's there, but is it really Africa? It's part of it, but it's not the whole picture. It's again an example of how Africa is useful for Western imaginations, for Western purposes. And here we just have to contrast with the other earlier works. I meant to say at the beginning, there's nothing I like more in teaching and in talking to folks like you than your questions. That's the real joy in it for me. So please feel free to raise your hand, interrupt, and of course we'll have